already been using the chat section, please feel free to use that at any time during the webinar to post comments or links you'd like to share. And also, if you have any questions, please type your questions in the chat section too. You can do that. And my colleagues Jonathan and Faye will be collating your questions during the webinar for Robin, Mary Lou and Monica speakers. We thought after each guest speaker we'd have a little bit of time for sort of questions of clarification, but then we'd have most of the questions, wider questions, when all the guest speakers have spoken. We'll have a wider discussion at the end. If you'd like to ask your question live on the video, that's fine too. You can wave your hand. The waving hand function is under the list of participants option on the Zoom screen. And just a little reminder that we are recording live on Facebook, and we'll be using the recording later on different social media, posting a copy. I'm just going to introduce each of our speakers before we start, so you don't have to keep coming back to me. Our first guest speaker is Robin Brookes. Robin is a member of the Executive Committee of Conscience and chairperson of Conscience Peace Tax International, CPTI. Robin is a war tax resistor and was member of the Peace Tax 7, which you'll be hearing more about later. And Robin's going to share with us a historical overview of conscientious objection to military taxation. Our next speaker is going to be Mary Lou Leavitt. Mary Lou is a member of the Religious Society of Friends, or Quakers, and has served on the Executive Committee of Conscience previously. Mary Lou worked with the Quaker Peace Action Caravan. I remember seeing that in the 80s as a campaigner, educator on peace and disarmament issues. And she then served as the Peace Secretary of Quaker Peace and Service, and later as its Assistant General Secretary. Mary Lou is going to speak about Quaker involvement in the peace campaign. And then we have Monica Frisch. Monica's been involved with Conscience since 1984, and she's an Executive Committee member, the Treasurer and the Director.
I'm going to give you these two questions, and the answers to each question is the same. If you get it for the first question, I'll give you 2 points. If you get it for the second question,
I can hear.
2 points. Derived from that character in Shakespeare's The Tempest, what is the name of the 5th largest moon of Uranus?
I can hear some. I'll keep going. So Monica's an Executive Committee member, the Treasurer and a Director of Conscience. And in this picture, she's taking part in an event that we organised outside the Ministry of Defence a couple of years ago, when we physically counted out the money that the UK spends on nuclear weapons in a year. We spent hours doing that. Monica's going to speak about campaigning for conscientious objection to military taxation. I'll now pass you over to Robin. Thank you all. Thanks for coming.
Right, good evening. I'll give you a potted history of war tax resistance, but before I do, I'll give you a potted history of my own, so you know where I'm coming from. I've been a war tax resistor since the Iraq War, and before that I was a member of Conscience since the 1980s, and I've been thinking about whether I should withhold taxes, but when 2 million of us marched in London to try and stop the Iraq War, well, that was the last straw for me, and I said I'm not paying them anymore. So I got in touch with Conscience, and Conscience are very helpful, publicised the fact and gave me all sorts of advice about how to deal with bailiffs and that sort of thing. And they also put me in touch with other war tax resistors. So we formed a sort of email group, and eventually we decided to challenge the government to a judicial review, to challenge the law on being made to pay for war. we called ourselves the Peace Tax 7. We were by no means the first to morally object to being made to pay for war through our taxes. And if I can start sharing screen, and that one, and we'll go slideshow from the beginning. Okay, go right back to the 12th century AD. And around the year 1195, St. Hugh of Lincoln, with the Bishop Herbert of Salisbury, resisted King Richard I's demand to supply and pay for 300 knights for a year's service in his French wars. He obviously felt that that was against their Christian calling. The entire revenue of both men's offices was then seized by royal agents. And so began the relationship between conscientious objectors and the government's revenue men. There's been a similar tale ever since. Moving on to the 18th century and the provisions that were made for Quakers. Quakers have always been known as a peace church. And in 1777, New York State excused Quakers from serving in the militia on payment of a levy of 40 shillings to the state government. And this would be used to purchase arms for the militia. In the 19th century, a Quaker in the state of New York refused military service and refused to pay this exemption tax to the state government, saying he wasn't going to even support war through his taxes. And he was excused on the basis that the tax would still be charged, but spent on other government support. In the early part of the century, this went to support common schools, and later it went to support the poor. In the latter part of the 1800s, the exemption provision was applied to all inhabitants of the state, regardless of their religion. So it took in a wider scope. Several states, Pennsylvania, for instance, followed this example. And in 1874, Congress specifically accommodated conscientious objectors to the payment of war taxes by providing that the fee to be paid was applied solely to humanitarian purposes. So again, that was a sort of wider remit of spending the money in a non-military way. Militias were disbanded after the Civil War and a federal army instituted in their stead. But religious exemption to paying military tax continues today in Article 2, Section 6 of the New York State Civil Rights Law. It doesn't apply anymore. And if we jump forward to early this century, Dan Jenkins discovered in 2006, when he challenged the Inland Revenue Service in the Court of Appeal, that he couldn't make this rather novel argument based on the fact that federal law, when it was set up so that it should not take away the rights of the citizen, which had already been awarded to them in state law. So it was a good argument. And by rights, Dan Jenkins should have been excused, as he would have been in New York State in the 18th century. But they didn't allow that. And unfortunately, he was still fined $5,000. This is for bringing what's called a trivial case, which basically means they've heard it all before, and he hadn't brought anything new, and you jolly well have to pay up. But in fact, I think they should have at least let him off the $5,000. Anyway, that's all water under the bridge. At this point, it's worth saying that taxes have always been raised to fund wars until 1945, almost exclusively for that purpose. In 1798, income tax was raised for the first time in Britain to pay for the Napoleonic Wars. And moving on again to later in the 18th century, Henry David Thoreau. It's probably the most famous instance of a war tax resistor. He was a writer, a naturalist, philosopher, something of a mystic. He opposed the imperialist and unjust nature of the Mexican War in the 1840s and so he refused to pay Massachusetts poll tax, which was levied for the war, resulting in a night in jail. Someone paid the tax for him, ending his protest abruptly, so he put his opposition in writing and created a document first published in May 1849 called On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. And I quote, "Must the citizen ever for a moment, or in the least degree, resign his conscience to the legislator? Why has every man a conscience then? I think that we should be men first and subjects afterwards. It's not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. The only obligation which I have the right to assume is to do at any time what I think is right." I'll paste that into the chat, but I can't access it at the moment. I'll put it in later if you want to read that again. Moving on to the 20th century, Joan Baez refused to pay 60% of her 1963 income tax because of the war in Vietnam. Others joined her, and by 1967, about 500 people had signed a pledge to do likewise. Two very strong movements currently exist in the US: the National Coordinating Committee of War Tax Resisters and the National Campaign for a Peace Tax Fund. In 1979, Stanley Keble brought his concern about having to pay for war through his taxes to Quakers in Britain. Now, for those not familiar with Quakers, a Quaker concern is quite a special thing. It's a particular feeling that something is wrong or something ought to be done about something, and it's taken through a whole process in Quakers right up to the national level, Britain Yearly Meeting. So it's quite a thing to bring this concern. And many others have since brought the same concern to Quakers, including myself and two other members of Peace Tax 7. They supported Stanley in founding the Peace Tax Campaign, which was later renamed Conscience. Quakers in Britain have supported the campaign ever since, but you will hear more about that from Mary Lou and Monica. There have been many war tax resistors in Britain since then. Some have been thrown in prison. Often they've been fined and had goods seized by bailiffs. Latterly, the government had learned not to draw attention to the issue by jailing COs, and these days HMRC are reluctant to seize property. Worldwide, there are and have been many other national campaigns supporting war tax resistance and/or pressing for a peace tax fund to be established. They range as far afield as Japan and Colombia. The strongest movements are in the US, Germany, Spain, and Britain. Every 2 years, there's an international conference on war tax resistors and peace tax campaigns hosted by one or another national campaign in their country. And in fact, there will be one later this year. If we're lucky, the end of September, we will be holding another international conference in Geneva. CPTI. In 1994, Conscience and Peace Tax International was founded in Hondarribia in Spain. The aim of the association is to obtain recognition of the right to conscientious objection to paying for armaments and war preparation and war conduct through taxes. CPTI was granted special consultative status with the Economic and Social Council of the UN in July 1999. And has since continued to press the issue of conscientious objection to military taxes at the UN. And so ends my history. Thank you. Unshare.
Thank you, Robin, for sharing your insights about the history of conscientious objection to military taxation. So now we would like to hear from you. If you have any questions for Robin, please raise your hand and my colleague Jonathan will unmute you. Alternatively, provide your question using the chat feature below, and I'll read it on your behalf to Robin. So any questions? Trying to see everyone. Any questions?
Karen has a question.
Karen?
Well, thanks, Robin. I wonder whether you could share a little bit more about your experiences as a member of the Peace Tax 7, what it was like for you personally and the other members of the group. It's a big question, I know.
Right, it is. It was very exciting. We committed to employing a lawyer to help us take the judicial review to the courts. And we had to raise quite a lot of money, which we managed to do thanks to a lot of support. I'm sure a number of the people here tonight contributed something to Peace Tax 7, and we're very grateful for all that. We took the case, first of all, we had to get permission to hold a judicial review. And we never actually got to hold the judicial review itself. But when we went to court, we really had the whole case reviewed. So in effect, the case was heard in court, but it was just on the basis of, well, we'll let you or won't let you do a judicial review. We got a lot of sympathy, actually. I think in the past, courts have been pretty dismissive of war tax resistors. I've always met positive responses, so I think that's a change. Over time, that actually they took us pretty seriously. We were refused the right to have a judicial review. We took it to the appeal court, and the appeal court said something pretty interesting. They said they thought that the European Court had taken too narrow a view of what a person's rights were in relation to paying taxes and all the rest of it. So that was quite a sort of positive thing they said, sort of in support. But they didn't let us have a judicial review, but they sort of said, well, you better go back to Europe and bother them. The other thing they did was that when we were in court, our lawyer started sort of explaining what our basis of conscience is, and they said, no, you don't need to do that. We accept that they're genuine and have a genuine conscience. So a quite positive experience, really, although it didn't get us anywhere. It did challenge the law. I think it's this case that you keep trying, you keep banging on the door. The good thing about human rights law is that it's what we call living law. So as society changes, so the laws can, you can go back and say, look, things are different now. You ought to be looking at this. So it doesn't close the door entirely. Give it a decade or two, maybe we can go back and challenge it again.
Thank you, Robin. So Wynne Kennedy asked, did John Baez and co go to prison for their withdrawal of tax?
I'm not too sure about that. They might have done. They tend in the US to seize property, and in fact, people have lost houses over there, which can't happen in this country. They can take your car, they can take various bits and pieces and sell them, but they can't take your house, and they can't take the tools of your trade. But in America, some people have actually lost their houses.
And Ian Martin asks, what was Keir Starmer like as your lawyer? And are you surprised he became leader of the party?
I was very pleased to see him become leader of the party. We had not a great deal to do with him. Our initial lawyer put us on to Keir Starmer and one other whose name now I'm going to forget. But there were two lawyers who were going to take the case to Europe, and Keir Starmer was leading that. So we did have a conversation with him, but it didn't get any further than that, because once they sent the deputation to the European Court, we got a sort of one-paragraph letter back saying, yes, we've seen it all before, go away, don't bother us again. So, you know, that was the end of that. So it was a rather short-lived experience.
Thank you, Robin. Any more questions for Robin? By the way, you can raise your hand and then unmute yourself. I mean, you're free to do that if you have a question. I can't see any more questions. So we can go to the next speaker. More questions? Okay, so the next speaker is Mary Lou, and she will speak about the Quaker involvement in the peace tax campaign. So yeah, Mary Lou.
Okay, thanks, Faye. Like Robin, I'll start with some personal detail about how I know what it is I'm going to tell you about this evening. I grew up as a Quaker. US American Quaker near Philadelphia in Pennsylvania, but in a Quakerism that's very like the Quakerism you would find here in the UK. So I grew up as a child, knowing that Quakers rejected war and violence and were committed to finding more creative and nonviolent ways of dealing with conflict on every level, from the personal through the political to the international. Where was that commitment coming from? Well, as Robin has said, Quakerism is its formal name, the Religious Society of Friends. It's one of the historic peace churches, along with the Mennonites and the Brethren. It has its roots in Christianity, and especially the radical Puritan Protestant Christianity of the Reformation in Europe and in Britain. Started in the period of the English Civil War in the 17th century. And the central insight of Quakerism is that there is something of God, the seed of the Spirit, in each and every one of us. So the divine is not only beyond and around us, but it's also within us. And we can access it directly without the need for a specially educated or anointed priesthood, without a particular sacrificial, sanctified place to meet, or special rituals and sacraments. Our understanding, and indeed our experience, is that the Spirit is accessible to us always if we still ourselves and listen, and that the whole of life is sacramental. So if that's true, if there is something of the divine in every single person, then the Spirit can and does work through any of us, and we are all radically equal in God's sight. So my life is not more important or precious than that of my neighbor or that of my enemy. And I can't respond to conflict with killing people who are also children of God, and for whom God is also, through whom God may also be acting. I can't use violence in response to conflict. And so I need to find other ways that reach out and answer that divine potential for healing and transformation in all of us. So that's what I inherited growing up as a Quaker. And I kind of took it for granted. It was just part of my faith. I also grew up in a country at war, though the war was rather a long way from me in Vietnam. So I also grew up knowing about conscientious objection to military service and about offering alternative service. I took all this for granted. It wasn't hard for me. There weren't mega choices to be made. I wasn't ever called up to fight. If I had been, I would have had a pretty direct route to conscientious objection, and I would have just offered alternative service. That would have been that. Fine. So I didn't test me, just kind of there. Fast forward to the late 1970s, the early 1980s. I've moved to London. I've become involved with Quakers here, and with the newly reviving peace movement, which at that point was basically an anti-nuclear movement. This is the time of the UK deciding to acquire Trident, and the US, the country of which I'm still a citizen, deciding to base its ground-launched cruise missiles here in the country I was living in at Greenham and Molesworth. I took exception to that. And I got involved with Quaker campaigns and other campaigns against those developments. And I wound up working, as you heard, for Britain Yearly Meeting, the national organization of Quakers in England, Scotland, and Wales. First as a campaigner and educator, and then as something rather grandly known as the Peace Secretary of Quaker Peace and Service. My brief as Peace Secretary was basically supporting Quaker anti-nuclear activism with a bit of peace education in schools, a bit of nonviolence training, a bit of networking, and the occasional bit of support and network building, supporting resistance to an actual war or threat of war, notably the first Gulf War. I was in post when that happened. And so at the heart of a resistance to that from among the Quaker constituency. And somewhere around the edges of my attention during the early part of this time, there were these persistent Quaker individuals who just would not shut up about conscientious objection to taxation for military purposes. Yes, Stanley Keeble, definitely one of them, but for me, it was primarily also Gerald Druitt. And both of them coming again and again and again through the formal structures of Quakerism saying, this is important, you must pay attention, you must do something about this deeply felt concern of mine. And so because it was my job to facilitate and support Quaker peace witness, I had to listen to them and to find out what they were on about and explore what the formal sort of corporate structures of Quakerism in Britain were supposed to be doing about the issue they were so passionate about. And from that time on, sort of the late 70s and the early 80s, throughout the rest of that 20th century, there was an ongoing dialogue or a kind of a dance, or sometimes it felt more like a tug of war between these indefatigable characters who kept bringing their concern back through the official structures of Quakerism and the response of the official structures themselves. And I was right in the middle of that, trying to facilitate it, trying to understand it, gradually moving from a personal position of thinking, what is all this about? Surely it's irrelevant, to hang on a minute, there's a point here, to actually, they're right. It is a consequence of my commitment to peace that I shouldn't be paying for war. But back to my official role, whenever the concern came up through the various structures to the center or to the yearly meeting as a whole, two things tended to happen. On the one hand, Quakers corporately agreed with, adopted, united with the principle of conscientious objection to military taxation. Yes, yes, they cried. This is a clear consequence of adherence to our peace testimony. And on the other hand, they regularly failed to find a way to take action on the concern as a corporate body. Although we continued to offer support and admiration to the heroic individuals who were acting under personal concern themselves, including friend Robin here and the others of the Peace Tax 7. And individuals, friends did keep taking action on the issue all through this period, from pretty low profile protest actions. A friend of mine who decided to pay her tax all in pennies, and she took it to the tax office, and she had made a mock-up papier-mâché drain, and she poured the money in pennies down the drain. And then they had to carry the drain up to the tax office, where they solemnly sat around watching people count that many pennies to see whether she'd paid her tax in full. So that was my friend Kim in the 80s. Also, Pleasance and John Holtham having their furniture distrained from the warden's flat in Hampstead Quaker Meeting House, with Quakers in support all around them. So lots of little individual things going on. And from low profile to high profile, people actually going to prison, like Arthur Windsor, for trying to divert his tax and to alternative service. But if we turn again to the issue of the relationship of this concern to the central structures, or the corporate structures of Quakerdom, there were kind of three distinct phases of trying to find a way of dealing with this issue on behalf of the early meeting as a whole. First of all, and Robin's touched on this a bit, there was the moment when in 78, 79, Stanley Keeble kept pressing the yearly meeting to take action, to start campaigning, to adopt this concern. And there was quite a thorough process of consultation throughout Quakerism, from local level up to the central work, and a resounding yes to the principle of what he was proposing. But because it was a campaign to change the law, and because we're a charity as a church, it was decided that we wouldn't do it ourselves, and we supported the formation of a separate campaigning organization, now known as Conscience, Taxes for Peace Now, or Quakers gave it, corporate Quakers gave it financial support. It has many Quaker members, individual Quakers acting as the office staff. Its first office was in a Quaker meeting house, but officially not part of the yearly meeting, officially a separate thing. So that was phase one. Phase two, maybe 2 or 3 years later, there was a moment when over 30 members of the staff employed by Quakers at Friend's House decided that they objected in conscience to paying the military portion of their tax. And they asked the yearly meeting, they asked Quakers in Britain to stand in with them by helping them to divert their tax, withhold it and divert it, or withhold it until they could be assured it wouldn't be used for military purposes, because they couldn't do it themselves. They were all on PAYE. Again, a long process of what Quakers call discernment, threshing, discussing, agonizing, thinking what to do, prayerfully considering all aspects of the issue, and finally at the gathering of friends at yearly meeting, deciding that we would stand in with these 30 more people who wanted us to take action on their behalf. There was a wonderful moment when one member of the meeting, one ordinary Quaker speaking from the floor in that discussion, stood up and she said, "I feel that what we may be about to do could be a mistake." And we all went, and she said, "But I think it's a mistake we may need to make." And the decision went through. Yes, we will stand in with staff. We will separate out that portion of their tax, which goes to military purposes. In those days, it was about 10%. And we set up a special bank account for it, and we withheld it. And Quakers in Britain were taken to court. It was the two women who were serving as the clerks, the chairs of the executive committee of Friends, Meeting for Sufferings, who went to court on our behalf. They were wonderful women, two little old Quaker ladies with the classic white hair and braids. It was just amazing. Very quietly explaining why we were taking this action on behalf of the staff. Of course, like the Peace Tax 7, we failed, the case failed, and we took it to appeal, and it was rejected again. And at this point, Quakers in Britain decided that they would pay under protest, but they would also take the case to the European Court of Human Rights. And again, like the Peace Tax 7, we were refused leave to bring the case. So ever since then, we have paid, but so the issue went quiet for a bit. 5 years later, maybe, 1987, it came back. Again, concern coming back again through the structures. The annual gathering of friends at the yearly meeting affirmed the principle of conscientious objection to military taxation without any hesitation whatsoever, they said. They affirmed the principle. And the committee I served, Peace Committee, set up lots of working groups to see what that might mean in practice. And we increased our grant to conscience. So the next move we tried was to try to get the yearly meeting, corporate structure of Friends in Britain, to take action as an employer to recognize that we were in fact acting as tax collectors for military purposes. For all our staff, we were collecting tax that was going to buy weapons and pay for soldiers and pay for killing. And so we took that question through the structures. Are we content to be a tax collector for military purposes? You know the story. Again, we said, no, we mustn't do this. We must do something about it. We agreed the principle that we objected to being a tax collector for military purposes, but we could not find a practical way of manifesting that principle. We eventually wound up paying the tax, the military portion of tax, separating it out so you could see it, and then paying it under protest. And for all I know, we're still doing that, but we never got to the point of actually trying to withhold it again or divert it. Two more occasions since then, Britain Yearly Meeting was offered the opportunity to affirm again the principle of conscientious objection to military taxation, once in 1992 or 3 after the first Gulf War, and again in 1995 on the anniversary of the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II. And both times, very clear unity with the concern, but no corporate action. Meanwhile, of course, quietly on the side, individual Quakers keep campaigning, they keep joining conscience, they keep taking action with their taxes, and bits of the national Quaker machine continue to support conscience with an annual grant, although it does keep getting smaller. There's a link friend from the central structures of Friends on Conscience Executive. And 3 times in the last 20 years or so, we've actually placed a 1-year worker with conscience to do a specific piece of work. The Quakers funded somebody for a year to work in the conscience office. The last one of these was Holly Wallace, who worked with Ruth Cadbury on her 10-minute rule bill. You'll hear more about that from Monica. So, but it's basically the concern, the issue has gone pretty quiet now. Most Quaker energy, if I'm honest, is elsewhere on the climate emergency, sanctuary and asylum issues, social and economic justice, arms trade and arms fairs. But conscientious objection really does still lie very close to the heart of the Quaker understanding of what our testimony, our witness to peace is all about. The rejection of violence, the rejection of outward weapons, not just using them ourselves, but paying other people to use them on our behalf. and the search for a more creative and effective way of preventing and resolving conflict. And that's what we would like the military portion of our, that is the alternative service to which we would want the military portion of our taxes put. So the seed of the concern is still there among friends, and probably still there dormant in the Quaker structures and active among a few individuals and a few meetings. And who knows where and when it might flower again.
Thank you very much, Mary Lou. Thank you. That was a really nice overview and review of the Quaker relationship with conscientious objection, the campaign for conscientious objection to be recognised legally. Does anyone have any questions for Mary Lou? Or Robin has a question already. Can you tell us how Britain yearly meeting paid under protest, i.e. what was the protest?
Oh, we wrote a letter. We wrote a letter every month with our tax return.
We got any other questions? Oh yes, question from Paula Shaw. With the horrendous increase in military spending announced recently, will this inspire a further campaign?
It might. Within the way Quakerism works, it's almost always a group or an individual, a small group or an individual who wakes up to an issue or feels the sting of something in their conscience and says, oh, something needs to happen here. And they then test it with their worshiping group, their other Quakers, and then they start bringing it through the structures again. So either you'll find people taking action, joining conscience, taking action with their taxes as individuals, or you may find that the concern wakes up again somewhere and starts moving on the trajectory I've described 3 times already, up through in through the various structures to a corporate place where it gets tested. And again, my guess would be we will unite with the concern. We will understand and affirm the principle of the right to conscientious objection to taxation for military purposes. Whether we will ever find as an institution, as a church, a way of acting together on it nationally at national level, I don't know.
Any other questions for Mary Lou? Like I said, you can use the chat or you can use the participant menu to raise a hand. Any other questions?
There's at least one other person on this call.
Amanda Woolley.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, it's just a comment. If it was successful, if it was successful, would the government not just increase what they put into military from the overall spend?
That's the argument, of course, and it's the same argument for conscientious objection to military service. If I am a CO, someone will go in my place. They won't have fewer soldiers. But what would be different if conscientious objection to taxation for military purposes was agreed would be that the money that was part of what I pay towards the military would instead be doing alternative service. So you would get money visibly diverted to conflict prevention, conflict resolution, peace building, that kind of stuff. Yeah, practical it's not, principle it is.
Any last questions for Mary Lou? No, in which case I will hand over to Monica, who's going to talk about the campaigning history. Monica.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. I hope you can now see it. I hope everyone can hear me. I'm Monica Frisch. I've been a member of conscience since the end of 1983. I've served on the executive committee in various roles since 1991, which is 30 years. However, I'm still doing it. I'm keeping going. I'm going to talk about campaigning for conscientious objection to military taxation in the UK. As Mary Lou and Robin have explained, conscience stems from other campaigns, earlier campaigns going back many centuries, as Robin explained. And when we were formed by Stanley Keeble in 1979, our name was the Peace Tax Campaign, not Conscience. We adopted Conscience as the title of our newsletter a bit later on. And in 1990, we became Conscience, the Peace Tax Campaign. Here's some of the early literature with the old name, the old logo. As you will see from my presentation, we have had some very good designers, some very imaginative and creative people, and it's been fun looking through my archive and reminding myself of all the variety of leaflets and things we produced. Our most recent name change was to Conscience Taxes for Peace, Not War in 2009. It was felt that that really conveyed the gist of what we were about. And while the word campaign or campaigning may not have been in the title of the organisation any longer, campaigning was and still is a key element. Here are some of our newsletters. The ones on the left are from 1993, 1994. The ones on the right from 1998, 99. Those of you who are members will have seen that the newsletter has changed in style again. As I say, we are constantly trying out new things, constantly being imaginative, I like to think. And you should be able to find the latest newsletters on our website. So if you want to read more, by all means. So campaigning takes many forms. Our key objective to achieve the legal right of those with a conscientious objection to war to have the entire military part of their taxes spent on peace building obviously requires legislation, and activities in Parliament, as I will talk about later, are inevitable a focus for much of our activities. But awareness raising is essential. So we've produced a whole variety of leaflets. Here are some examples. I rather like the ones like the Mock Military Service Act 2016. But we've had a whole variety of different styles. I also like the message that everyone thinks that paying for war is a fact of life. We don't. We are conscience. One of our leaflets was produced, well, all of our leaflets were produced by the 1,000. They were distributed at the time mainly as inserts in the publications of sympathetic organisations, such as the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, Pax Christi, magazines such as Red Pepper. We distributed them to Quaker meeting houses and churches. It wouldn't surprise me if there's still Quaker meetings which have a few of our leaflets lurking in a leaflet rack somewhere. Our £10 note leaflet was very successful, but this picture shows us having to burn a batch. They were burnt on the instructions of the Bank of England because they looked too similar to the real thing. So we had to redesign it, but we're still using it, and we've still got a whole range of other leaflets. Some people may feel this isn't really protest. They associate protest with the big demos that the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and the Stop the War Coalition and other organisations organise in Trafalgar Square and other places. Conscience has never really gone in for those sorts of activities, but we do recognize the value of street action. We recognize the value of being visible. We appreciate that on the big peace demos, there are going to be a large and sympathetic audience. So we have made banners, we have made posters, and we have gone along to these things. One of our successful approaches is to pretend to be a taxman collecting taxes for war. But we've also turned up as the Grim Reaper on occasion. More things. I think there's the Grim Reaper carrying a missile. We have street stalls. The purple house style is fairly recent. I'm not quite sure which event that is. I think it's one of the party conferences. And of course, we take part in International Conscientious Objectors Day every May. Last year was online. I think this year will also be online, but I'm sure we'll be there. And we will also be participating in events around Remembrance Week in November. These days, we have a website, conscienceonline.org.uk. We also, as Mary Lou have said, have had several Quaker peace workers. One of them created a second website for us, peacepays.org.uk. Unfortunately, it's not operating very well, but we hope to redo it. And now, of course, we use social media, Facebook and Twitter in particular, to spread our concerns about war and peace and about the compelling urge to pay taxes for peace, not war. At the same time as we've been doing all this awareness raising, there have been conscience members whose consciences directed them to take action, who were prepared to risk breaking the law. The campaign did not and does not condone law breaking, but it does provide information and advice about war tax resistance. As you can see, we produced a leaflet bearing a passing resemblance to some of the leaflets that Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs were producing at the time on how to avoid paying for war. We produced a mock peace tax return. These we gotten our members to submit to HM Revenue and Customs, Inland Revenue as it's often known. We produced publications, as you can see, and from about 1982, one of the war tax resistors coordinated a tax diversion network and published a newsletter called Tax Direction Now, in which war tax resistors could share their experiences of trying to redirect their taxes. And in about 1987, there were about a dozen different individuals, all resisting paying war tax in various ways. Some were paying under protest, as Mary Lou described. Some were just being steadfastly awkward. And we did find that bailiffs, the threat of prison, did result in increased publicity for the issue and for the campaign. There were 4 people who have spent time in prison. The first has already been mentioned, which was Arthur Windsor in 1986. Then there was Sean Edwards in 1987. The photo on the left is of Nigel Wilde from Newcastle upon Tyne, the third war tax resistor to go to prison in 1991, when the Inland Revenue refused his offer of payment in kind with freshly baked bread buns, 182 to represent the £182 in taxes they believed he owed. And Roger Franklin served 2 spells in prison in 1995 and 1996, as well as being made bankrupt. But it was hard to protest. So as far as I know, no one else has gone to prison since then in this country. But with the Gulf War, and there was more concern, and the photo on the right is of Mercy Healy, who withheld the military portion of her taxes as a protest over the sanctions on Iraq and the threat of further military action there. I'm not going to say much about the Peace Tax 7 because Robin has already explained about that. But as he said, 7 conscience members banded together, raised a very considerable sum of money to hire legal experts and to take the case for a peace tax through the courts as far as possible. One thing I must emphasize is that none of the war tax resistors were trying to avoid paying taxes. They just did not want their taxes to be spent on war and preparations for war. So what did they want to spend their money on? There was a variety of approaches, but generally it boils down to the fact that they recognize that peace is underfunded. For every military £1, less than 1 pence goes towards peace. There are ways of resolving conflicts, of tackling conflicts, of preventing wars, of resolving things. And there are root causes of war that are known and ought to be tackled. So that's the sort of thing that most of us war tax resistors feel the money should be spent on. As an aside, someone asked Mary Lou whether any of these protests would have any effect if the law was changed. Would it make a difference? I love the idea that HM Revenue and Customs would have to, somewhere in the small print of a tax return, put, do you want to withhold your war money on grounds of conscience? I think that could be a very powerful and subversive approach. And of course, you know, should the legislation never be passed, I think conscience would be up there trying to publicize it. Now, conscience and taxes are not restricted to the UK. And as Robin has said, there are international groups elsewhere in the country. And they hold conferences every few years. I think Conscience, the UK organisation, has been involved in every single one. We've organised 3, the first in 1996 in Hoddesdon, then in Manchester in 2008, and most recently in Edinburgh in 2019. And I'm sure we will be actively involved in the next one. Along with all this awareness raising and publicity seeking, we have commissioned reports to explore the arguments further and to consider options, new avenues for promoting our issues. So we've looked at the Human Rights Act, we've looked at the workings of the Minister for Peace and Disarmament. For a while, we had a group funded and with an employee specifically to look at peace and security related topics. The Peace and Security Liaison Group brought together over a dozen non-governmental organisations, and they were looking at establishing mechanisms for policy discussions at the governmental level on security related topics. And they did in fact succeed in establishing informal meetings with government officials. This work is now being carried on by other organisations. We did reports on non-military security solutions. We followed the work of the Oxford Research Group and other organisations who were putting academic effort into such things. And we discovered that the government did have something that could be called a peace tax fund, which is the government's conflict pool, and its successor, the Conflict Security and Stability Fund. Now, none of these are quite perfect, and we did quite a lot of work looking into how the conflict pool could be reformed, how we could ensure that the Conflict Security and Stability Fund actually didn't end up spending its money funding military activities sort of by the back door indirectly. But this was all useful work for developing our contacts with Parliament. working with MPs and influencing decision makers has clearly been terribly important right from the start. And indeed, one of the ongoing activities at the beginning was recruiting sympathetic MPs. And we did this by getting our members to lobby their MPs. And when their members expressed interest, we could send them further information. And when they expressed support, we added them to a list. And the list was public. We published it in our newsletters. And by 1999, we had 86 supportive MPs. And no, they weren't all Labour Party. There was one Conservative. I think he still supports us. Some Liberal Democrats, some from Plaid Cymru and some from the Scottish National Party. We also had 5 members of the Scottish Parliament, 3 of the Welsh Assembly, and 16 members of the European Parliament. We've also had supporting lords and bishops at various times. So we've done various activities around Parliament, around the political system. We have attended party conferences, but that's a costly and time-consuming activity, particularly if one wants to go to the Conservative or the Labour Party conferences. We find the minor parties are more receptive to our messages, and indeed, at various times, the manifestos of the Green Party, Plaid Cymru, and the Scottish National Party have all included policy supporting conscientious objection to military taxation. We've used our supportive MPs in many ways: questions in Parliament, early day motions, which are a form of parliamentary petition where an MP puts down a motion and again then seeks to get his and her colleagues to support it. And then there's actual legislation. Oops, wrong slide, sorry. One of the earliest activities was actually in 1981 when Alex Lyon MP tried to amend the finance bill, unsuccessfully, obviously. And on 3 occasions since then, we have found MPs to propose peace tax legislation with different titles and approaches to the top issue. In 1986, Dennis Canavan introduced a bill to establish a peace tax fund. In 1994, Neil Gerard moved that leave be given to a bill to reform the system of taxation so that taxpayers are enabled to hypothecate on grounds of conscience a portion of taxation to purposes which they nominate. This conscientious objection, brackets public expenditure, close brackets, bill was passed without a vote and was given a date for a second reading, but it never received that because it ran out of parliamentary time. The same happened 5 years later when John MacDonald introduced the military expenditure, brackets conscientious objection, close brackets bill, that leave be given to bring in a bill to give taxpayers the right to direct that portion of their income tax which would otherwise be spent on military purposes to a fund for international aid. And the same bill was read the first time and ordered to be read a second time, and again it wasn't. The slide in front of us is of our activities outside Parliament when we were working with Ruth Cadbury MP to introduce a 10-minute rule bill, the Taxes for Peace bill. Again, it got read. They listened to it politely in Parliament, if I remember rightly, in the House of Commons, and then it ran out of parliamentary time. We shall have another go again soon. So, over the past 4 decades, campaigners for conscientious objection to war tax resistance have explored many avenues for achieving their objectives, which I've touched upon above. But there's much more. In particular, I have not said much about local campaigning, but conscience members across the country have leafleted local events, organised meetings, raised their concerns at their Quaker meetings or at their churches, as well as supporting the campaign and many other peace activities in many other ways. And this is one of our current and extremely energetic campaigners, Anne McCulloch-Lisk, campaigning in Scotland, as you can see, with conscience banners, copies of reports, leaflets. even conscience tote bags. So, as can be seen, Conscience Taxes for Peace, Not War campaigns in many different ways, and we will continue to do so, as it is essential to use a variety of means to reach different audiences and to get our concerns across. Without information, people, including legislators, will not understand the issues. So we're currently running an education program to put together fact sheets to explain the issues. Without understanding, people, especially legislators, will not be inclined to get involved, to make changes, and to take action. So we continue. We continue campaigning for the right to pay taxes for peace, not war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Monica, for the great presentation of the campaign history of conscience. So do you have any questions? Does the audience have any questions? Please raise your hand or use the chat below. No questions? Okay, so do you have any questions for the other speakers? Mary Lou, Robin, or just to everyone, anyone who you would like to cover some of your questions that were covered today?
Can I ask a question of the audience?
Yeah, please.
We have this wealth of historical information, and I would love someone to help us put together a history of conscience. We've been going since 1979. We have all this information, but our hardworking staff, Jonathan, Karen, and Faye, don't have time hardly to look at the stuff, let alone to catalogue it and so on. And if there are any volunteers who would like to help with that, or indeed with other tasks, I think it would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. So
already got one volunteer, Maddie Fry.
That's incredible. Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Excellent.
Great. So I think some closing information from Karen.
Share the final slides.
Yes, just to let you know that our next webinar is going to be considering what we want the military proportion of our taxes to go to. In the previous conscience bills, we've said slightly different things about that over the years, and it seems good to think about that again and what we'll actually what we're actually going to be asking for. So it won't necessarily be completely specific, but in general terms. So we're working on that webinar at the moment. Yes, and asked how to get in contact. One way is to go to our website and you can sign up for our e-bulletins, and you can follow us on social media. That's all there. We've got a Twitter feed on the first page of the site. Details of other social media. And thank you, just a huge thank you for joining us. It's been very moving, yeah, hearing the speakers and seeing such a lovely audience. We're going to be leaving the webinar open if people want to chat informally afterwards, so we won't be shutting it down straight away. Thank you again, and I hope you join us again. It's lovely to meet you. Thank you.